Good morrow, nerds. It is I. And we'll just jump straight into this. We are back with some more RPG Shorts reactions. I've combed all over YouTube for the most insightful, entertaining, and strange RPG-related YouTube Shorts that I could find. And we'll be going over them, seeing what we can learn from them, and just having some fun. So, if that sounds good to you, then sit down, buckle up, and prepare for even more of these, as I've got 6 this time instead of 5. But before we go any further, please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications, or I will be reacting to your behaviour with disapproval. Now, let's get this show on the road.
What if I told you there was a better way to roll stealth checks? Usually, in most games, the way it goes is somebody says, I want to sneak over there, and then they roll a stealth check to see how well they do. And that's fine. But you can make it a little bit more exciting. What if instead of rolling the stealth check when the player decides they want to start sneaking, they roll the stealth check when there's a chance that someone might see them? Like, that moment. You want to sneak into the fortress? Great. Go, you do it. 3 turns later, you're down the hall and there's a guard. Roll a stealth check. This can help avoid the weird metagaming thing where if a player knows they rolled really badly on a stealth check, maybe they will, decide to do something else. And it also makes stealth more of an active gameplay mechanic, which I should point out is neither a good thing or a bad thing. It really depends on the type of game you want to play.
So yeah, I do think it is very important to consider not just what you're rolling, but when you're rolling it. I wouldn't say that playing metagaming with stealth has been such a big issue for me. And you know what? This is how I do things. I tend to make people roll stealth checks when there's a chance of them being caught. There's another way to do this, which some GMs use here and there to avoid metagaming, which is to do secret rolls. And personally, I think that Cinderblock's method here is generally better. Secret rolls, we can get into the whole rolling in secret ethics thing, but it does tend to be considered less trustworthy by players. There is a third method that I've seen that was first proposed in the Cyberpunk 2020 core rulebook, which Seth Skolkowski has a video about, I'll link it below, which is where you roll usually 6 stealth checks or perception checks at the start of the session, and then the GM cycles through them. There's a bit more nuance to it than that. Go watch his video for more on that. You should always consider not just what you're rolling, but when you're rolling it, because that will affect the feel of play. The final point I think to make here is how often you roll these stealth checks. If you're rolling them every time, you could potentially be caught either by the same guard or different guards. That can make being discovered almost inevitable. Some RPGs like Burning Wheel and Torchbearer have what's called a let it ride rule for this very reason, where once you've made a roll once and you've succeeded, you don't have to roll that thing again for the rest of the scene. Likewise, if you failed, yeah, you're not going to be doing any more sneaking for a little while now. This does kind of come down to player and GM preference and occasionally system quirks. With Burning Wheel and Torchbearer, making too many rolls, especially of the same skill, can start to mess with skill progression. Because skills are advanced individually based on the number of tests that you make, and in the case of Burning Wheel, either the difficulty of those tests, or in the case of Torchbearer, the success or failure of those tests, you don't want to be making too many. That said, for D&D and for most other more traditional RPG systems that use experience points rather than individual skill tracking, a few extra rolls here and there won't really matter. But speaking of rolls biting you in the arse, let's move on to short number 2.
No, because listen to what you are asking me, okay? Let me just repeat it for you. You are digging a hole that is up to your knees in a place you are not supposed to be digging. When someone comes to confront you, you are trying to lie to their face and say you are fixing a smaller hole? Fine. Go ahead and roll me deception check with disadvantage. That's an 18 plus 6, 24. And that's a nat 20. Fine.
What are you doing? I'm fixing a divot. Oh. He's fixing a divot!
You know what? That divot looks pretty fixed to me. But as for the rolls, yeah, sometimes you don't want to be rolling. I think the big controversy in situations like these is whether you should allow a roll at all. And there are some GMs who aren't comfortable saying, no, you cannot do this, especially with social interactions, or even just in general. Some GMs, maybe if they're less experienced, will feel that they need to decide everything by a roll, and that if they just make the difficulty high enough, then failure is all but guaranteed. That's not how that works. First off, any roll, no matter how difficult, barring certain system quirks, can be succeeded, and likewise, any roll, no matter how easy, can be failed, barring some system quirks. If you're calling for a roll, you need to be equally comfortable with both success and failure. If you are not comfortable with failure, do not call for a roll. If a player is opening an unlocked door, they can just open it. Do not make them roll to open a door. Likewise, if they're asking someone their name, just have the NPC give their name. It's not worth making persuasion for. But the reverse is also true. You cannot pick the lock of a solid stone wall. Likewise, you cannot lie without having some sort of plausible alibi. Telling players no does get contentious. Some GMs would say you should never do it. D. Vincent Baker, who is one of the more influential indie game designers, is well known for his say yes or roll philosophy, where you either say, yes, you can do that, and there's nothing, or you say, oh, give it a try, set a difficulty, and let them roll. I slightly disagree with this. I do think there are times as a GM where you should just say, no, you're being ridiculous, let's move on. On an unrelated note, my players complain about me being evil. But as we're on the topic of GM advice, let's look at YouTube's advice for another sphere of GMing.
What I'm calling the golden rule of theater of the mind. Use your conjunctions. And, or, but. And allows you to show off character competencies and introduce new elements in a way that benefits the players. You can run up the stairs and avoid the skeletons trying to block the way. You can move into the room, shoot, and find a piece of cover to duck behind. Because we're not focusing on precise detail, instead trying to create compelling cinematics, be generous. Let your players' heroic abilities be awesome. Or let you give meaningful tactical choice without relying on a grid. You can get 3 goons in the blast, or you can get the boss in 1 goon. You can get to the nearest monster and strike, or you can dash and get to the wounded one. Or it can also be used to put your players on the horns of a dilemma. You have enough movement to get to AC, or you can get to the door. You can get out of range of the deadly gas, or you can leave cover and be peppered with arrows. You are ramping up the drama with your framing, while still allowing your players to decide the course of events, but allows you to place restrictions on your character's actions and features without straight up denying the opportunity to facilitate.
This is, I would say, a good example of some of the things that you can do very well by being a loosey-goosey GM. Now, I am notoriously not very loosey-goosey. In fact, I am almost autistically rules as written about just about everything. When I have done Theatre of the Mind, I have counted out in my head the distances of player movement. Not only that, I have mentally mapped out area of effect templates to figure out the exact number of zombies you hit with that fireball and which zombies it was. No, you didn't get zombie 1 or zombie 5, but you did get 2 to 4, 5 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, and 22 to 24. So please pause while I make 21 dexterity saving throws. Yes, I have done that before. The other thing that I want to point out here, this is a very D&D centric short, so I'll point out some things from other systems. A lot of newer RPG systems tend to rely on deliberately imprecise movement. Things like using zones or range bands. And when you use setups like that, such as what you find in Conan 2D20, is where I've had the most exposure to it, you do get much more vague but cinematic movement, and that does allow for some of the things that this guy is talking about. Trying to do exact movement in Theatre of the Mind is always extremely difficult. In fact, a lot of mechanics like zones or range bands are deliberately put in to make Theatre of the Mind easier, although notoriously Cyberpunk Red's range bands for ranged attacks just seem to make things harder for some people. So it doesn't always work out, but yeah, you can be flexible in places, you don't have to be as rigid as me, do what you want. But once you've had your Theatre of the Mind combat, it will be time for loot. And when it comes to loot, there are some important things to consider, such as what's covered in this next short.
The fewer words a magic sword's name has, the more dangerous it is. You don't want to be on the wrong end of Dark King Grutmore's Edge of Annihilation, don't get me wrong, but you for sure don't want to be on the wrong end of something called the Throngler. Dark King Grutmore's Edge of Annihilation implies other Dark Kings with other Edges of Annihilation. But there is only one way to get Throngler. I can't say thrungled with a straight face.
I think there are two lessons we can take from this short, the intended one and the unintended one. Let's start with the intended one. Yeah, short, simple names are more impactful. It applies in marketing and it also applies in RPGs. But there is something else to consider with names, and that is, unless you're doing a deliberately comedic or silly game, especially a comedy one-shot, you need to be able to say any name you give something with a straight face. Now, I actually have a story about this, of a previous Cyberpunk Red campaign. Now, we're all sitting down for session 0, and everybody is doing their life paths. Now, one player, who I don't believe had actually played RPGs before that point, was going through his backstory NPCs. It's called the life path, it's a full backstory generator, and it includes your character's friends, their enemies, and their tragic love affairs. And he was going through and giving every single NPC name either a penis joke or a poo joke. So, I took him out of the room, gave him a dressing down, and said, listen, there is plenty of room for jokes and comedy in RPGs, but you need to be able to take your character and any NPCs they will regularly interact with at least a little bit seriously. And so yeah, having given him a bit of a talking to and bringing him back into the room, the matter was settled. He gave his characters some more serious names, but rest assured he and I got plenty of opportunity to crack jokes at the table further down the line. But ludicrous or boring names can seem like a fairly trivial concern compared to something like a player dying, or all of the players dying. But as we're about to see with this next short, sometimes the biggest problems can also be the rarest.
Dungeon Masters, you need to start worrying about TPKs, is what you might think based on the amount of people online who talk about TPKs and how to avoid them, including me. So this is just a quick reminder that in 5e D&D, it's really hard to actually lose a player, let alone an entire party. Now, of course it does happen, but the 5e rules are written so it's quite easy to avoid. Remember, when a player drops to 0 HP, they've got at least a couple of rounds to do their death saving throws, during which time other members of the party can stabilize them with a basic medicine check. And the chance of a medicine check can be avoided with a healing potion or a healing spell. As long as the rest of the party are being somewhat sensible, most players can be stabilized before they even roll their first death saving throw. Now, you still need to balance your encounters properly, and your players still need to exercise some intelligence at the table, but don't panic if 1 or 2 players in a party of 4 or 5 go to 0 during a fight.
I think beyond the obvious inconvenience of it, the reason that people still talk about TPK so much, and by extension worry about them so much, is because they were much more common in older RPG systems. If you look at, say, Moldvay Cook BXD&D from the early 1980s, if you went to 0 HP in that iteration, then you were dead. There was no unconsciousness, no death saves, just bye-bye. And bear in mind that your hit points at first level were 1d4 plus Constitution modifier, 1d6 plus Constitution modifier, or if you were really lucky in playing a fighter or a dwarf, 1d8 plus Constitution modifier. That is not much, especially when having a negative modifier, especially on the rolled stats of early D&D, could be pretty common, and when rolling a 1 meant that, yeah, you have 1 HP for your fighter. Congratulations. If you take a single hit at all, you are dying. So yeah, there are a lot of people who still have hang-ups from that period, and even some modern RPGs are incredibly deadly. I have in previous videos complained about how squishy characters in Call of Cthulhu are, for instance, because, well, they are. Falling damage is 1d6 per 10 feet, and your average character has like 11 or 12 HP. It doesn't take too much of a fall to cripple them. That being said, I've had my fair share of kills and even TPKs with D&D 5e, even with its admittedly very forgiving mechanics. And that is because my first campaign was Curse of Strahd. During the 32-33 sessions that ran, we lost 18 player characters, including sometimes as many as 3 in a session. And the reason was 1, very hard encounters, 2, not necessarily having great opportunities for rest or healing, and 3, the good old-fashioned having the monsters poke the unconscious PCs to give them automatic death save fails. That one is plenty of fun. Oh, and of course there was that one session 1 TPK that I had in my last D&D campaign. I don't talk about that anymore, but for some reason, the players from that session still do. I don't know why they're so hung up about it. They're just being triggered, honestly. But perhaps what they need to get over their wimpishedness is some healing. And of course, in the world of D&D, the ultimate healer is the cleric. Or is it?
A lot of people will tell you that you need a healer in your D&D party. Whether or not that's true, it might sound kind of limiting, until you realize that in D&D 5e, druids and bards are just as good at healing as clerics, and rangers are pretty good at it too, and so are paladins. But that's not what I want to talk about. Because I've never heard anyone say that you don't need a healer, but you might need a cleric. And I've been thinking about this comment for a little while. And I genuinely do not know if you just mixed up the words healer and cleric here, or if you genuinely think that you don't need a healer, but you do need a cleric. Why would you need a cleric? I don't know. Sure, clerics are definitely one of the strongest classes in D&D 5e, but I'd argue no stronger than druids. So, can somebody help? And I'm not saying this to belittle this commenter at all. There's a lot of stuff that I do not know, and this might be one of those things. So why do you need a cleric?
So I think there are two things that I immediately want to push back on here. The first is the idea that having a healer isn't strictly necessary in D&D, and I would genuinely disagree. D&D is a very combat-heavy RPG. There is very little for the players to do outside of combat and magic, and if you're getting into combat, you're taking damage. Now, a party of adventurers' ability to take damage is more than just the sum of their collective hit points. It's also the amount of hit points they can get back. And while there are things like hit dice, healing potions, and the very, very generous you get back all of your HP with 8 hours of sleep rules of D&D 5e, nothing comes close to having actual healing spells and spamming them ad nauseum. The other thing I would say is that clerics actually are the best healers, especially life clerics. Druids and paladins come close. In fact, some years ago, friend of the channel, Min Max Bunch King, did a video of how you can multi-class together cleric and druid for some truly, truly stupid healing, which I will link in the description. Bards and rangers do also have healing abilities, as do some warlocks, the Celestial I believe. So yeah, there are other ways to do it, but life clerics are generally the most potent. As one of my players learned, much to his surprise, having made a cleric, bitched about how ineffective it was, and then realizing just how much healing he was capable of doing, and then getting very excited. To the point where, after that campaign, he is still hassling me to run D&D again, so that he can keep playing that cleric, even though I don't want to run D&D anymore. As for the question of why would you need a cleric, not a healer, this is an interesting one. Clerics have long been an integral part of D&D. They were in the original white box, along with the fighting man and the magic user, subsequently renamed to the fighter and the wizard. And they actually predate things like the rogue and the ranger, or the thief as it was called back then. They were back then a kind of cross between fighters and wizards with a bit of healing thrown in. And that's kind of where they sit to this day. They're a kind of fighty, magic-usy, healy thing. And then you have paladins, which lean more towards the fighter side, and they've also split off to form things like the druid, which was in 1st edition AD&D a sub-variant of cleric. So yeah, as for why you would need them over necessarily a healer, there are non-heal specialty types of clerics in 5th edition D&D, such as the war or trickery clerics, which do have some neat abilities here and there. What clerics offer in many ways is there is some great roleplay potential that goes beyond the mere healing. Being a religious figure, they can serve as a moral compass for the party, and they also kind of serve to tie the players and the party in general into the institutions that appear within the fantasy setting. Religious groups throughout history have had varying levels of stratification, organization, hierarchy, all of that stuff. But almost all of them have at least some, and when you make a cleric, you are kind of implicitly binding your character into such a group. And that's something that a bard can't really do. A druid can do, but differently. A paladin can also do, but differently. And so yeah, there is certain RP potential that a cleric has that nobody else quite has. And so yeah, sometimes the real healing is the clerics we played along the way. And with that, it is a wrap. I hope you've all enjoyed this video. It was a bit lazy, but simple. I do have some more fun things coming down the pipe. As I've said before, I am trying to do weekly uploads until the end of the year, and so far so good. If you enjoyed this video, then please hit the like button, share this with your friends, and leave a comment down below. If you'd like to see more videos like these, then hit that subscribe button and the bell for notifications. Now, I'm off to go remind my players that complaining about TPKs is irrational beta male behavior. Once more though, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.